Right, so let's discuss pre-thinking in this video. Now, once upon a time on the GMAT verbal section, pre-thinking was the norm. But of late, I see a lot of experts dissing the concept of pre-thinking, looking down upon it. And the argument they give is, how can you pre-think the answer to a question, or why do you want to waste your time pre-thinking the answer to a question? And my response to that is, you're not trying to pre-think the answer to a question. Why would you do that? That will be an absolutely idiotic thing to do. So let me start by giving you the conclusion of this video. Pre-thinking is a great idea. I've been teaching it since 17 years. I've also seen others teach it who had no affiliation with me. And it cannot not work, assuming you apply it correctly. And in this video, I will show you exactly how you want to use pre-thinking to your benefit. And keep in mind, while you are thinking pre-thinking is only relevant on critical reasoning, that is not the case. I use pre-thinking on reading comprehension, on data insights. I use it on DS, I use it on TPA. So when I teach students those topics, you will see me use a lot of pre-thinking. And that saves me time, and that also improves my accuracy a lot. So what is the concept behind pre-thinking? See, the idea is very, very simple. It's easier to find something when you know what you're looking for, right? If I take you in a room and I tell you, find my favorite object in this room. I mean, the room contains so many items, how will you find it? But if from some other information I've given you, you can infer that the object is spherical in shape, it's made of a metal, and it's somewhere in the northeast corner of the room, then that makes life a lot easier for you, right? Then your chances of finding the object increase exponentially. So something similar will happen on GMAT questions also. If you know what you're looking for, one, you won't be confused when you look at good wrong answer choices. You will also save time, because what you do right now, you will keep reading every answer choice twice, thrice, and comparing them with each other and eliminating based on that, which is a very slow process and a very ineffective process. Like when you do critical reasoning questions with me, you'll see a lot of the answer choices I won't even read completely, because they will have nothing to do with what I know the answer should look like. So let's talk critical reasoning only, because that's where pre-thinking will apply the most. So on critical reasoning, pre-thinking will not mean predicting the answer. Let me say it again. It is not predicting the answer. How can you predict the answer? You can't predict the answer. Pre-thinking means pre-think the assumption. Assuming you are doing an assumption family questions, which I hope you know what they are. 5 of them: assumption, strengthen, weaken, evaluate, and flaw, which is more than 50% of the question types that appear on critical reasoning. If you're doing any of those, you know the stimulus given to me will be in the form of an argument. Hopefully you would know how to dissect an argument. 3 components: conclusion, evidence, which is what you call premise, and the most important one is the assumption. The assumption is what you want to pre-think on critical reasoning, not the answer. Of course, if it's an assumption question, then the assumption itself will be the answer. But if it's a strengthen question or a weaken question, then the assumption won't necessarily be the answer, but the assumption will take you to the answer. To strengthen the argument, you have to pick an answer choice that will tell you that whatever you assumed is going to be true. To weaken it, you have to say whatever you assumed is incorrect. The flaw will be the assumption, right? To evaluate, you have to again check whether the assumption is true or not. I mean, I'm giving you a quick critical reasoning refresher, but I'm hoping whatever third-party resource you've used has taught you these things. If not, then you need to start from scratch, by the way, which may not be a bad thing, because then you will be doing it the right way, starting by learning pre-thinking on CR. Because if your methods have already been corrupted, that's the best word I can use. If they've already been corrupted by using some nonsensical strategy, then it will take time, because you will have to first unlearn that and then learn this. But you want to learn this. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'll take you to some questions now. Let me actually show you in practice what pre-thinking looks like, why you want to do pre-thinking, and why it's a great idea. Right, so here's the critical reasoning question on the screen. I haven't given you the answer choices yet, because I want you to do some pre-thinking along with me. So while I'm not teaching you critical reasoning, I will be discussing a few things that I would have taught you had you studied from me. The first of which is I always start by reading the question stem. I don't start by reading the stimulus, because when I read the question stem, I know whether I'm looking at an assumption family of question or I'm not. And accordingly, I decide whether to do pre-thinking or not. If it's an assumption family, I will do pre-thinking. If it is not, it's an inference question or an explain question, I won't waste my time doing any pre-thinking, because as I said, I can't pre-think the answer. I can only pre-think the assumption, right? So in this case, the question is clearly an assumption question, right? So let's read the argument. In recent years, many cabinet makers have been winning acclaim as artists. Okay, but since furniture must be useful, cabinet makers must exercise their craft with an eye to the practical utility of their product. For this reason, cabinet making is not art. So if you've done your concepts in a proper manner, you would know every argument has 3 parts to it. I'm going to go quickly through this. I'm not teaching you everything. So there will definitely be a conclusion. Every argument has to contain a conclusion, which is nothing but this line. And if I ask you in one line, what is the argument saying? That what is basically going to be your conclusion, right? Gives you the answer to the question, what? So the conclusion is cabinet making is not an art. Why is it not an art? That why is basically your evidence, or what a lot of you known as premise. Same thing. So conclusion is what? Evidence is why. The moment you figure out this is my conclusion, the rest of it is the evidence. Then don't bother as to this sentence is intermediate conclusion and this sentence is some other nonsense. That's just a strategy to confuse you. It's either a conclusion or it's an evidence. That's about it. Now in this case, some people do get confused. So always try to paraphrase the argument in your head. Why is cabinet making not an art? What's the reason for that? I'll give you 2 options. Cabinet making is not art because cabinet makers are paying attention to the practical utility of their products, or cabinet making is not art because cabinet makers are not paying attention to the practical utility of their product. Which one is it saying? Go and figure it out. Okay, so I hope you figured it out correctly. What it is saying is cabinet making is not an art because cabinet makers must pay attention to the practical utility of their product. That's the argument. Sounds absurd what they're saying, but that will be the case with a lot of critical reasoning arguments. It's not our job to question the absurdity. We only have to point out what is this person assuming when they conclude that cabinet making is not an art because cabinet makers are paying attention to the practical utility. That's the pre-thinking that you must do. I mean, if nothing comes to your mind, then go to the options and fine, you will most likely get the answer because it's not a very difficult question. But that is like there will always be a missing link in every argument. The missing link is how you move from the evidence to the conclusion, and that missing link is called the assumption, the most important component of every argument, the most important concept in critical reasoning. And this is what I want you to pre-think. You don't pre-think the answer. You pre-think the assumption which will take you to the answer. In this case, it will of course be the answer. And what is the assumption? The assumption has to be that if something has practical utility, it cannot be considered art. It has to be the assumption, right? Think of it, if I say, oh, you are from India, so you will not get into Harvard. An absurd argument, but if I say that, you are from India, so you will not get into Harvard, what am I assuming? I'm not assuming that Harvard is biased or Indians are stupid. I'm not assuming any of those things. I'm assuming that nobody from India can get into Harvard or gets into Harvard. That's the assumption, right? Assumption is something which has to be true for your argument to be true, your conclusion to be true. That's the assumption. So if I show you the answer choices now the moment you look at the answer choices, pause the video and go through them, you will get the answer instantly also because we've already predicted what the answer will look like. It has to be D, that will be the answer. An object is not an art object if its maker pays attention to the object's practical utility. That is your assumption, because people do get confused on this question for no reason. I've seen B being a popular answer, but some cabinet makers are more concerned than others with the practical utility of the product. Who cares? Not my concern who's more concerned, who's less concerned. My concern is what is the missing link? How can it not be art just because these guys are paying attention to the practical utility? That has to be D, right? The should is almost never going to be the answer to any critical reasoning question because should means suggestion. Now, nobody on critical reasoning will ask you for your suggestion, even though as humans we love to give suggestion. Don't do it on critical reasoning, right? E is of course out of scope. But again, I'm not teaching you critical reasoning. I'm just telling you, start using pre-thinking. And what will you pre-think? The assumption. On critical reasoning, pre-think the assumption. Let me show you a more difficult question. Pause the video and try it once and then come back and let's do it together. Right? Now tell me how many of you went with D as the answer? I'm guessing a lot of you. Also A and B are popular ones, right? But what is the correct answer? Let's see. Let's try to pre-think. Let's see what it says. The first thing, which of the following, if true, best supports the argument? Simple, strengthen question, right? You have to strengthen the question. And again, if you've learned from me, I would have taught you the only way to strengthen a question is to say that whatever is being assumed in the argument is correct. And the stimulus will always be an argument, by the way, for a strengthened question or a weakened question. So I know there has to be an argument over there. So I know there will be a conclusion based on some evidence and some assumption that will not be stated over there. Assumption cannot be stated. So you've already read the argument. What was the conclusion? conclusion was right here, that parents who wish to improve the strength and performance of the children should expose their infants to the most important thing, classical music. What is the argument talking about? Not classical music. The argument only speaks about Mozart's music. So then the conclusion should have said that the parents should expose their children to Mozart's music. Why expose them to classical music? And that's where the assumption comes in, right? That's the pre-thinking. The assumption has to be what applies to Mozart applies to all classical musicians. It is what you must have studied, a representativeness concept being tested. Right? They're assuming that Mozart is representative of all classical music or musicians. And then the answer can't be D. D would have been the answer had the conclusion been for Mozart. The conclusion is not for Mozart. The answer will be E. Right? The ones who got to E, you've done pretty well, assuming that you had seen this question for the first time, because some of you might have seen these questions. They are official questions. And if you think about it, E is nothing but the assumption in the argument. Assumption will always strengthen the argument. In fact, 70% of the time, the answer to a strengthened question will be the assumption. But my point, pre-thinking, very, very useful. Had you done pre-thinking on this, you would not have gone with D. You would have gone with E. Let me also show you a TPA question, two-part analysis. You get a lot of critical reasoning on TPA, right? I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I'll just make you think the assumption by reading that, because there is an assumption required. So what I want you to do is pause the video, try this question, and just think of the assumption. When ideally I would rather you don't look at the answer choices and think of the assumption in your own mind, because the answer choices will anyway confuse you. So try it once and then come back and do it with me. Right? So what does the argument say? There were several porcelain production centers in Britain, among them Bristol, Plymouth and New Hall. Each center developed a unique recipe for its porcelain that might include whatever, nobody cares. We will therefore be able to determine on the basis of, that's your conclusion by the way, we will be able to determine on the basis of compositional analysis where the next cup we recover was made. So paraphrase, very, very important. The conclusion is, we will be able to figure out where the next cup we recover was made. What is the evidence? How will you be able to figure out? Because we know that each development center had its own unique recipe. The key thing is, recipe for what? For porcelain. That's the key thing in this question. There's a big assumption over there, right? That the next cup that we recover will also be made of porcelain, right? What if it's made of copper or brass? Then all this doesn't apply, right? That has to be the assumption in the argument. So if I look at the answer choices, the answer would be this. The next cup to be recovered will likely be made of porcelain. That has to be the assumption. Otherwise, you can't conclude what you're concluding. And I will let you try the possible fact by yourself. But these critical reasoning type questions will become a lot simpler if you start doing some pre-thinking. I, of course, do pre-thinking also on other questions. Data sufficiency, I do a lot of pre-thinking. Before I look at the two statements, I think in my head, what information do I need to answer this particular question? Because a very common trap you would have seen on DS, if you're struggling with DS, is the answer choice C. The correct answer will be A or B, but you will end up going with C. So the C trap you will be able to fix if you start doing a little bit of pre-thinking as to what information do I need to answer this question. So pre-thinking is a great strategy. Please start applying that. People who tell you not to do pre-thinking do not understand pre-thinking or the benefits of it, or they're just trying to confuse you. Right? So you saw how pre-thinking works and why it's very, very useful, highly beneficial. So please start using that strategy the way I have taught you. In case you have any questions, any problems, drop me an email or just ask in the comments below. I will get back to you. But please start using pre-thinking. Start with CR, eventually extend it to other question types. Cheers everyone.